Go. Derek Mulhern from AFP Global and Carmen Marshall from Maryland Nonprofits. And I was actually going to save it to the end, but this session is being recorded. So if you didn't get the pop-up and alert, please know that it is being recorded. So if you can mute your microphones, that would be great. And I will leave it to the presenters to handle questions and stuff, how they would like to proceed with that. Just a little bit about Apra Maryland. We are a prospect research. We are part of Apra International, but we're the Maryland chapter for prospect researchers, prospect managers, people in the nonprofit fundraising sphere who want to learn more about obviously research, pipeline management, prospecting, and any sorts of kind of relevant topics and trainings of that sort. This particular topic is very important to us because we have started a DEI committee of our own so that we can really be more understanding, more sensitive, and really just more just in our activities, everything that really surround how we do business, how we take it into our personal lives, how we take it into our personal business sectors too. So one plug that I also have before we truly get started is that we in Apra Maryland, I should say, is having our fall conference November 8th through the 10th. Registration is open now. Registration is also free. So if anybody would like to sign up for it, please feel free. You can go to the Apra Maryland website and register there. We have a lot of great programs. We're going to be talking about prospect management. We're going to be talking about cryptocurrency, all kinds of really wonderful topics that I think really, for us, push kind of forward and advance our industry further into funding the great work that we all are a part of in our individual spaces. So with that, I will turn this over to our wonderful speakers.
And we're actually going to pass it over to Sam real quick to introduce from the AFP Maryland side.
Thank you all. For those who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Samantha Flatamish, and I am the AFP Maryland chapter president. Like Apra, we're a part of an international organization, and we are the Maryland chapter. I want to thank you all for taking the time today to join us for this incredibly important discussion. We are thrilled to be partnering with Apra to take a deeper look into DEI and fundraising ethics. I remember meeting with Joanna back in May of this year, where we talked about partnering on an event together. So it's really wonderful to see this come to life in our program today. I just want to extend my sincerest thanks to the incredible team from Apra, Joanna, Megan, Frank, and Teresa, and everyone who helped support this event in co-organizing. And then obviously a big thanks to our amazing team from AFP, Nancy and Liz, who are our program committee co-chairs. You guys all made this event a reality, and we are so deeply grateful for the space and conversation today. For those who are unfamiliar with AFP, our mission is to foster the growth and development of a culturally diverse population of fundraising professionals, enhance philanthropy by encouraging giving and volunteering, and promoting ethics in fundraising and sound nonprofit management throughout Maryland. We are really steadfast in our chapter and as an international organization of our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we really continue to honor that commitment through our chapter's programming, like today, where we're providing space for conversation and educational opportunities. I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about our chapter, or if you're interested in becoming a member, to go to our website. It's afpmaryland.org. We'd also love for you to join us on November 18th for our virtual National Philanthropy Day event that will be talking and continuing our conversation around DEI in philanthropy. We are having Vu Lei from Nonprofit AF. He's going to be our keynote speaker. And then we're also going to be doing a program on pay equity. So another really important conversation in philanthropy. I also want to thank Carmen, Derek, and Megan for presenting today. Thank you all so much, and thank you for your participation. And now I'll turn it back to Teresa.
Thank you so much, Samantha. So as Apra Maryland Tech Support today and Vice President, just wanted to give you kind of an overview of the day a little bit, or of the session. We are going to, in a short minute, do a quick poll, really just to understand where you guys are starting from, how your organizations are doing around DEI, what conversations you've already had, and kind of set the stage for kind of our conversations to go on. We're then going to have Carmen, Megan, and Derek do an overview of ethics and DEI in their kind of spheres of influence. Then we're going to switch it into kind of a panel presentation moderated by Carmen with Derek and Megan serving as our experts. Then we're going to break out in breakout sessions, really have a much smaller conversation with people that are in similar roles to us or in similar areas that we're interested in. Then we're going to have a Q&A. A couple more housekeeping items. As Frank mentioned earlier, we are recording, so that will be available afterwards. We will also share the brief PowerPoint slides afterwards as well. So if you need that, you'll be getting them in your email soon. Any questions that you have, please just drop them in the chat. We're going to be monitoring it throughout. We'll probably save most of them for the end during our Q&A session. But if there's anything that pops up that's super relevant at the time, we will try to get it, address it as they go. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our quick little poll. It's only 4 questions. So there we go, and launched.
Do we have results?
We have about 56% now, so give everyone a couple more seconds to do it if you haven't had a chance to yet. Oh, here. Someone said they weren't able to finish, so let me... Oh no, it disappeared on everybody. Here, let's try that again. I'll relaunch it for everybody, and then we'll see what happens.
Sounds good.
Let's try this again, guys. Technical difficulties. There we go. It's going much faster now for everyone answering. That's a good sign. Okay, we got 73% that time. So I'll go ahead and
awesome.
Share.
Okay. So it looks like we've got 44% of the folks saying to the first question that their board of directors is actively engaged in DEI work. That's great, but then you have 44% of that are not sure, which is interesting, right? And then 13% said no. For the second question, is your organization staff only engaged in the DEI work? And we've got 41% is the majority saying that on a monthly basis, they're engaged in some type of training or workshop or conversation. Quarterly and then annually coming in about the same 26%, and 8% are saying never. Number 3, is DEI included in your organization's value statement. 64% says yes. 23% says no. That's always 23% says unsure and 13% saying no. That's always interesting when folks say they aren't sure, right? So we need to do some work on communicating the work that we are in fact doing. Is a commitment to DEI included in your strategic plan? 77% are saying yes. 5% saying no, and look at the unsure number at 18%. Thank you all for engaging us in that way. Very interesting. Should make for an interesting conversation. So I think, Nancy, I'm handing it off back to you.
Yes, thank you, Carmen. Hi, I'm Nancy Fenton. I am the co-chair of AFP Maryland's programs along with Liz Schumann. I have the pleasure of introducing our terrific presenters and Carmen, who serves as our moderator. So our first presenter will be Megan Horton. Megan is the prospect research analyst at the University of California, San Diego, and she's also chair of the Apra Ethics and Compliance Committee. Megan has been working at University of California, San Diego Advancement since 2015, where she has worked with campaign operations, corporate and foundation relations, and is now involved in both prospect research and prospect management. She currently serves as chair of the Apra Ethics and Compliance Committee and has presented at several conferences, including Apra Prospect Development, AFP Icon, and CARA. Before coming to San Diego, she worked in El Salvador and Washington, D.C., where she worked in violence prevention and Latin American social justice nonprofits. Megan has a BA in International Affairs from George Washington University and an MA in Latin American Studies from the University of California, San Diego. She originally hails from Cleveland, Ohio, and in her spare time enjoys reading, hiking, her dogs, and cheering on Cleveland's improving sports teams. So welcome, Megan. Our moderator for today's session is Carmen Marshall, and we all owe Carmen a big shout out for a very successful Maryland Nonprofits Conference. So glad to see you here, Carmen. It was a great program. Carmen is the Director of Consulting at Maryland Nonprofits, and she is also their Chief Equity Officer. So Carmen knows firsthand how transformative it can be when people get serious about confronting racism, sexism, and the other isms and schisms that divide us in the workplace and community. Informed by her work in civil rights, Carmen is dedicated to working with world changers, organizations, and leaders who are serious about making progress in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is what Carmen has to say about DEI. As a country, we don't necessarily do a good job talking about racial issues. It's hard. It challenges everyone to look at themselves and the systems of oppression that plague us. And if we can't bring ourselves to talk about it, then it becomes doubtful that we'll do anything about it. Carmen is also the creator of Uncovering and Confronting Racism, Laying the Foundation for Transformative Change, a program designed to help organizations in their equity and inclusion work. Her work with CEOs, boards of directors, and teams has earned her the reputation of peaceful gatekeeper and master facilitator. Carmen is the former executive pastor of the historic Bright Hope Baptist Church in Philadelphia. In that role, she shouldered both the executive and senior pastor responsibilities in the absence of a senior pastor. She is the first woman to lead the congregation in 107 years. She is also the former executive director of the National Black Media Coalition. Thanks, Carmen. Thanks for joining us today. Our second presenter is Derek Mulhern. Derek is the Chief of Staff of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. And AFP is also AFP Global. In this role, he serves as a trusted advisor to the CEO. Derek supports guidance of AFP's strategic plan and assists in representing AFP on a global scale in order to grow the association in the fundraising sector. Prior to being Chief of Staff, Derek served as Chapter Engagement Director with AFP, serving its chapters and members to drive overall chapter success. While not a trained fundraiser, Derek is no stranger to the nonprofit sector and has deep experience working with member-based organizations. In 2020, Derek was awarded the 40 Under 40 Award by Association Forum and was recognized as an up-and-coming leader in the association sector. Prior to joining AFP Global, Derek worked for Fair Trade America, whose aim was to provide farmers in developing countries a fair wage for their work. Earlier in his career, Derek spent time with the Organic Trade Association, the American Farm Bureau, and Agriculture Future of America, where he focused his talents on managing volunteers and growing the association's memberships. While Derek has a strong history working in the agricultural sector, he's welcomed his new role with AFP Global, working with its members to solve some of the world's most complex problems through fundraising and philanthropy. A native of Minnesota, Derek holds his BS degree in agricultural education with an emphasis in leadership development from the University of Minnesota. Derek resides in Washington and is an active member of the American Society for Association Executives. He loves to travel, explore new restaurants, and spend quality time with family and friends. Welcome, Derek. And now I'm going to turn it back to Carmen, and she'll get our speakers set and ready to go.
You're on mute, Carmen.
Thank you so much. I bring you greetings from Maryland Nonprofits, and it's really a delight to be with all of you. You know, I don't know if it's still done, but there used to be a time when kids used to come home with vocabulary lists. In the days of COVID and remote learning, I don't know if they still do that, but I do remember a time when we had to learn how to spell words and had a vocabulary list, all with the aim of helping us to broaden and deepen our abilities to communicate. And I believe that we might find ourselves in a similar situation these days, especially as we grapple with complex issues. And so if we had a vocabulary list, and if you were taking notes, and if you were thinking about how do we engage in these complex conversations that come by many names, whether we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, or what have you, racism, oppression, you know, any number of things. I think that what would be included on that list would be words like transparency, words like trust, words like accountability, words like accessibility, words like justice and integrity. And today at the top of the list that we're going to delve into today, it is ethics. And I believe ethics sort of ties to all of those words that I mentioned: trust, accountability, right? And yet there can't be any trust. I've had people say to me, Carmen, just give us tools so we can build trust. But trust first has to be earned, and then you can build from there. And so, and we've all seen what can happen when an organization loses sight of those notions and concepts and core values of trust and transparency and integrity. And I don't come to you as, regardless of what people call me, I don't come to you as an expert, because we at Maryland Nonprofits are on our own journey. We're having to look at our own selves. We're having to look, and I'm happy to report that we're doing it not only internally at the staff level, but also at the board level, because we believe that it takes everybody doing their own work. And oftentimes you'll find that there are parallel journeys, that there are individuals having their own journey and their own work to do, and the organization or the institution is on its own journey. And we've seen what can happen when organizations lose sight of the fact that they hold sacred the mission of the organization, that they're to safeguard the mission and to safeguard the public trust. And when organizations lose sight of that, the result can be devastating. Loss of funding, loss of reputation, loss of work, loss of services to the community. And so ethics then, I believe, has to be at the top of the list. And I'm excited today to be able to engage in this conversation with both Megan and Derek to talk about how ethics is connected to diversity, equity, inclusion. And I like what Derek threw in, justice as well, right? And so I just want to open the floor up now. Megan, if you wouldn't mind, just sort of give us your overview of how you see entering this conversation today.
Thanks, Carmen. I have like a little, very quick overview of our DEI data guide that the Apra International Ethics and Compliance Committee recently did. So I'm going to do it hopefully not too fast, but quick enough. So here are some scenarios that I think will resonate with most of you, or at least in the prospect development side of things. Leadership in your organization asks you to pull a list of, let's say, all Latino alumni because they are looking to raise funds for Latino scholarships, or a list of Latinos in your database because they are in the middle of fundraising for a health initiative for underserved populations, or you are asked to pull a list of Black constituents in your area for a diversity initiative at your organization, or to build a list of quote unquote diverse board nominees. As a prospect development professional, we are asked to prospect and build lists on a regular basis. But race and ethnicity and other identity information is of a more sensitive nature. So what are the ethics surrounding these scenarios? When we talk about DEI data in fundraising, we are talking about identity-related data. So the slide is a list of the most common DEI data-related data points. It goes beyond just race and ethnicity. Every individual person has many intersecting identities, most of which are invisible, and these identities can change over time. Not all identity data points are sensitive or private. However, some categories are very sensitive due to histories of discrimination, persecution, and lack of access, as we know. And that's why DEI data must be treated accordingly with the utmost care. Utilizing the data represents how we determine which categories of people are seen and who is erased, who counts and who doesn't, who gets invited to the dinner table or the salon event and who does not. Next slide, please. Behind every personally sensitive piece of information that we have in our databases is a real person, a real individual. It's important to understand and operate with this in mind. Your constituents, alumni, supporters, volunteers, colleagues, they all need to know that your organization respects the people behind the data by ensuring an ethical, secure, and transparent collection, data, storage, and use of this personally sensitive information. Next slide, please. The key ethical concern in DEI data collection is that it must be self-identified or self-disclosed. Through self-identification methods, such as surveys, our organizations can ensure that we are honoring how each individual sees themselves. It also allows each person to opt in or to opt out of the data collection and usage. So no one is forced to disclose information they do not wish to share. To put it simply, we cannot put someone in a box in which they have not agreed to be placed. This self-reported identity data, which is often personally sensitive, needs to be stored and shared with the highest level of care. Make sure this data is stored in a secure database, on a secure drive, in a secure cloud storage system, or at the very least, a password protected document. DEI data should only be used by individuals who need the information based on their job duties to carry out their work. For example, a gift officer may not need access to identity data for your entire database, but may have a valid reason to access the information for their own portfolio. Although utilizing the data can be daunting, we can still use it if there's a business purpose. The identity data is a data point that can be pulled from your system for use in prospecting. The distribution and details of the prospect list should be handled with extra care to avoid unnecessary or accidental sharing of personally sensitive information. Also, as a sort of workaround, you can create research lists or funding interests. So instead of utilizing the specific identity data, you can create a broader, more inclusive list or way of grouping your constituents for specific interest-based prospecting. Next slide. We realize that a lot goes into working ethically with DEI data. And so here is some just key takeaways of what to avoid, what would be unethical or could be illegal. Please, please, please do not infer an individual's race, ethnicity, or other identity information based solely on social media, yearbooks, photos, names, or other third-party sources. While you can look at a LinkedIn profile and think that a person identifies as one way, you don't know how they self-identify. So just don't make any assumptions. Companies or vendors who sell DEI data, there's a very high degree of mistrust when it comes to selling identity information. There's a lack of transparency, which is very important, as we know, regarding the source of this information, as well as how the information itself is gathered. Since we do not know and can't ensure that it was ethically sourced or self-identified, we highly discourage the use of vendors to collect identity information. Medical information, particularly when it comes to accessibility issues, be careful to not disclose an individual's diagnosis, especially in contact reports. The sharing of that sort of information without permission violates HIPAA. And even if you aren't a medical institution, the spirit of HIPAA lives on in everywhere. So you can honor accessibility needs without discussing a person's particular diagnosis. Using the words needs accessible parking or donor needs subtitles on stewardship videos are easy, ethical ways to provide respect to your constituents without including a diagnosis. Admissions data collection. Some admissions departments do collect race and ethnicity data, which is typically published in aggregate. However, that information shouldn't leave the admissions office. Fundraising can have access to name, birth date, address, student's major. However, anything beyond the basic data could risk breaching FERPA and student privacy. And finally, we want to take care not to tokenize our constituents by looking at only one element of their identity. Just because a person identifies as a woman doesn't mean that they will only give to, say, women's health. And men or non-binary folks may also be interested in funding a women's health initiative. A Latino alumnus shouldn't only be contacted for Latino scholarship funds. As I've mentioned, and as we know, every person has many identities, and we want to ensure that each person is treated as a unique individual and not just part of one demographic. Next slide. So I know I've talked fast, and this is just scratching the surface of the work with DEI identity data. So the Apra Ethics and Compliance Committee created a toolkit of how to ethically collect, store, and use identity data. It goes in depth about best practices and then has additional resources with links that go further in depth and provide real world examples that you can apply at your own organization. The data guide is simply the beginning of how prospect development professionals can ethically work with identity data. We look forward to continuing to learn from our colleagues at AFP, CASE, AASB, and others. And we plan to revise the data guide every 3 years or so. In the meantime, the guide is live and free on the Apra website. And as that sound next door, I'm going to pass it off to Derek from AFP.
Perfect timing, Megan. The ambulances and fire trucks just finished going by my window. I hear another one. First, congrats to Megan and her team on the DEI inclusion or equity and inclusion guide. I've kind of taken an opportunity to peer through it, and it's an excellent resource. So I hope you all take an opportunity to take a peek at that. And then just a quick thank you to all of our organizers today for all the work that they've done and for having us here today. So I'm going to try and breeze through this really quickly. We're just a touch behind schedule. My name is Derek Mulhern, Chief of Staff with the Association of Fundraising Professionals. So why am I here? In my role, I oversee our ethics program and our ethics committee, which I'll talk about a little bit more. AFP represents just over 26,000 members globally. Primarily that's in North America. And basically our mission is to really empower ethical fundraising for all fundraisers, whether that be a frontline fundraiser or somebody that's a grant writer or somebody that's working with the data and research side of fundraising. Today, I'll be coming to you from the frontline fundraiser vantage point, but know that all of what we do within ethics is kind of surrounding multiple different facets of fundraising. Next slide. So we ask ourselves often, is ethics still relevant today? And, I've got a couple of examples up here that I'm not going to go into, but yeah, ethics is definitely relevant, and it's very much more relevant in fundraising and even more specifically in a time of challenge. So the last 18 months, I would say AFP has received an increased amount of ethical complaints, an increased amount of ethical inquiries as it relates to practices that have happened around the pandemic, but then even more so around a lot of the kind of reckoning that we're going through as a country right now with social justice. And one of the things you'll hear me talk about today is the instance in Washington State with a few hospitals that gave preferential treatment to donors to receive vaccines. So that's just one small thing on a very macro scale of how we can continue to see how ethics is part of frontline fundraising, and how it continues to affect equity within our space as well, as we really dig deeper into looking at that intersection. Next slide, Teresa. So what does that mean for AFP, and how do we kind of look at ethics and where we're at with DEI, or as we call IDEA work? So we really look at the code, and we continue to try and make the AFP Code of Ethical Standards and its reach broader. Each individual that is a member of AFP must sign to adhere to the AFP Code of Ethics, and that is enforceable. And so we have a committee that oversees that. And their role is to maintain the code. Right now, we're actually going through a full code revision. And I'll talk more about that in the answer of some of the questions that we get posed today. We really do that enforcement piece, the judiciary piece, if there are breaches of the code by members. And then we're just a resource to the general community to say, hey, how do we really continue to help individuals within this? Next slide, please. So really at the end of this, what does it all mean? Because this is a conversation about ethics and where it meets diversity, equity, inclusion, and what we throw in there all the time is access as well. And as we continue to look forward into the next 3 to 5 years of fundraising ethics here at AFP, we have a lot of reckoning to do as we consider the foundations of what philanthropy was set on. There's a lot of wealth that was generated off of racism and slavery, and a lot of wealth that we have to really understand where it's coming from. And some of our typical and traditional fundraising practices may need to be things that we start questioning more often. That being said, we've also traditionally, as an organization, really looked at donors and asked ourselves, how do we protect donors? How do we protect donors' rights? How do we protect their privacy? How do we protect their information? And that is all important. But I think we have to start asking ourselves the question, and as it relates to our DEI work, how are we protecting our fundraisers? How are we assuring that each of you in your roles every day has the opportunity to feel enabled to do your job free and in a safe space, whether that be that you're experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace, whether that is gender biases as you end up working in a space with a donor, or whether that is racist comments as you work with donors. So I think that there's just a lot of things that we need to consider, and I'm looking forward to a really good, robust conversation about it. Back over to you, Carmen.
Wow. Did you both just put so much on the table? Now I got to figure out where to pick from this feast of ideas. So Derek, you put on the table both the institutional journey and the individual journey, and that there's the workplace, what's happening in the workplace for fundraising professionals. There's that, right, that requires some sort of ongoing and active participation around this conversation. And then there's the work out in the field itself. And so when we think about, and Megan, you talked about the need to be responsible and ethical when it comes to data and how it gets used. So, and I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask you, but before I get to those, when you think about the agenda of your organizations or the sector, if you just had to put your finger on maybe 2 or 3 or 4 things that should be on the agenda of organizations in the sector as they consider fundraising, what 2 or 3 things would you say, hey, if you had to just tack on the wall Post-it notes with some agenda items, what would you say they might be? And you can decide who goes first, Derek or Megan.
I'm happy to hop into this first, Megan. So, I think that for fundraisers and for their organizations, I think, one of those first things that I would say, as we specifically look at fundraising, that organizations need to consider is what the role of the fundraiser is and how that might need to adapt and change. I think that we've really in the past done a great deal of work of holding our fundraisers accountable to specific goals, which is needed and something that is part of every role. But I think that we have to start asking ourselves the question, how do we not do that at the expense of their well-being? And I mean that in the way of that both that equity piece, but just that comfort level in workspaces. We've been doing a great deal of research around sexual harassment and fundraising. And this is primarily, I wouldn't say 100%, but primarily focusing on sexual harassment from men to women. And the research results that we've got said that about 76% of individuals say that they feel that they've been sexually harassed by a donor in the past. And situations like that can't be held to a point where we are now holding our same frontline fundraiser to the same status quo of what we've been doing before, because they shouldn't be having to put themselves in front of something to get a gift just because that is what benefits the organization. So that's number one. And then number two, I would say that fundraisers have a really unique spot in the organization, specifically frontline fundraisers. That is clearly a hard thing for me to say. And I think that we often forget the role and the influence that these individuals have with their board of directors. So as we really engage fundraisers more and we have the opportunity for them to be out and about with donors and working in the philanthropy zone, I really think that they have a lot of opportunity to push some of the DEI work into their boards and really help some of those boards come along on that same journey. It's a little bit more complex than me saying it like that. And I could go into a whole hour-long presentation about that in general, but really the connectedness that fundraisers have with their volunteer boards of directors is a great opportunity for us to better kind of assess and understand where the organization sits. And then just lastly, really quick, every organization needs to be going through a DEI assessment right now and needs to really understand internally what that means, not just externally what they're doing for their constituents.
Thank you, Derek. Megan, your thoughts?
So apologies for the leaf blower. We all have these
You
issues.
can't hear it.
Okay, great. For me, the primary thing is what's the mission, right? What is your organization's mission? And so the ethics of the donors, right? We want to make sure that, you know, our organizations don't end up in a Netflix documentary, right? So doing our due diligence to make sure that we're working with people who align with our mission and values. And also that we are talking to those people in ways that respect our mission and values. And so it's kind of, I don't want to say basic ethics, but it is DEI focused in that we want to respect each individual and that it aligns with our mission, right? So, and the way we're going about it aligns with our mission.
Mm-hmm.
So from a prospect development perspective, I would definitely say due diligence, and just making sure that you're vetting and approaching things in a stand-up way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. What about policy, Megan, when you think about it, how might, sometimes inequities can hide out in policies, but how might an organization create a DEI data policy?
Yeah, you want to start with the purpose, right? You don't want to just say, hey, alumni, or hey, constituents, what's your race? You know, that's a loaded question and I wouldn't want to necessarily answer it. So you want to be transparent, as you said, Carmen, right? Why do you need it? And then have that need expressed through how you go about collecting it. So that's how I would kind of start any sort of policy or activities that you have at your organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, when we think about safeguarding data and safeguarding the public trust and their information, we don't realize that you don't have to be a board member to care about that, right? I often say that, you know, being a board member is not the same as being a gym member. You don't go to the gym, nobody cares. But if you sit on a board, you ought to care about these things. You ought to care about the ethics. You ought to care who serves on the committee and what they're doing with the information and so on. And so you raise a good point. Derek, what about you? When you think about the DEI and ethics in the work that you're doing, what does that mean for frontline fundraisers?
Yeah, I think
share?
It's a huge question. I wish that I had a very, very straightforward answer for this, but you know, I think that the traditional way that we have looked at ethics has been very rigid into, you know, is this situation an ethical situation or not? Does it break a code of ethics? And you know, in every ethical situation, there's gray matter. In every situation, there's gray matter. That being said, I think that we're going to have to really start to ask ourselves a lot more questions for frontline fundraisers of what's bad behavior, and you know, maybe just not acceptable, and what's unethical. And I don't want to negate that bad behavior may also be unethical. But as we kind of look at trying to set standards around, and this is in a very technical way of me answering this question, not in a kind of grandiose way. As we look at grander ways of, or very technical ways of approaching ethics in an enforceable way, and that's just kind of how we do it at AFP, there has to be some type of delineation there between the difference between bad behavior or you know, frowned upon behavior and things that are actually unethical. So what we're doing at AFP right now is trying to understand our code of ethics and flesh that out in a new way that allows for us to have what we would almost consider like a preamble to that code of ethics, so that we can sit here and say, this is what we're actually trying to get at, everyone. We aren't just going to say, don't accept compensation on a percentage base, yes or no. This is the story of what we want to achieve through having an ethical profession. Therefore, these are the codes that or the numbers that we're looking at, or the standards that we're looking at. And we have a better ability to then pull situationally things that may be bad behavior into some of those things to be more enforceable around what we would consider bad behavior. But, you know, really, I think our fundraisers really just need to start asking themselves some specific questions also about how they do their prospecting. You know, as they go to donors, whether that's a typical donor they've gone to in the past or a new one, what is really, you know, getting these people to give? Because traditionally we've built, you know, what we would consider kind of scenarios around who would give on a predominantly white culture. So people of color actually give for very different reasons. And we need to start considering all different types of constituencies in our kind of fundraising practices to assure that we're being equitable and meeting those donors where they're at, but also understanding what their needs and desires are, not just approaching that from a one scope lens.
So this is for either one of you. How important is it for there to be a variety of voices from different perspectives to weigh in on these questions? When you consider your own fundraising practices and processes, how important is it for you as a fundraising professional to get a variety of perspectives on how you conduct yourself?
I can jump in just from the back end of things. We always say that data, you know, people think that data is just, it's pure, right? But people, you know, imperfect people with biases create, you know, algorithms. Mm-hmm. We are very aware of like Facebook algorithms, right? But even in our own database, those algorithms are built off of people with our own biases. So even if they're unconscious, like thinking, oh, a wealthy zip code, that totally erases histories of redlining and discrimination. And so, you know, someone may have a lot of wealth, but it's not in a desirable zip code, right? And so having a diverse group of people who are building models and putting in the data and who know more, a variety of things, it can only help, you know, what the output is. Mm-hmm. That's a very data focused answer, but
Thank you.
As you should give, Megan. Data focused answer is good. And I would just, you know, chime in really quickly on this. And I'm going to state what I think is obvious, but I have come to learn that it's not. Is that as we look at having different perspectives and different voices engaged in these conversations, I think it is so easy for us to go to visible diversity. And we need to take a step back as our organizations and assure that we actually understand what diversity is, and then go beyond that. Yes, diversity is great, but what's more important is inclusion. How do we assure that we're creating environments that when we bring all of these different perspectives to try and have these conversations and solve problems, that these individuals are there and they feel that they can actually share those pieces of feedback and those really relevant pieces of information, because it may be great to sit here and say we have an extremely diverse board, but are they engaged in actually doing anything, or is that just for show? Is it just performative? So how do we create that inclusive environment to be able to have diverse voices that contribute and move the needle, so to say, into that positive direction?
So we want our listeners and viewers to feel free to add your questions in the chat as we go along, so that when we get to the end, we can begin to answer some of them. So Megan, when you don't have a direct contact with a prospect, how do you have access to the self-identified data?
Right. So obviously we want to get self-disclosed information. Right. One workaround, I guess you could say, is we call them proxies. So organizations that have identity information in the title, like say someone was a member of the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus, like, oh, there's a data point that you can see that, you know, someone is likely a member of the LGBTQ plus community. But again, it's not foolproof. You don't want to assume that just because someone's a member of something that they, you know, that is their identity. But, you can create an interest or we love research lists, right? So especially for, as I said, with a business purpose, like, oh, this person, because they are affiliated with the Gay Men's Chorus, they may be interested in giving to our LGBTQ student center. So that sort of thing. You never want to put, like I said, you never want to put someone in a box that you haven't, 100% confirmed that they are, a part of. But you can use it for funding and research interests. So that's my take.
Thank you. Derek, how do we protect frontline fundraisers and hold them accountable in situations around DEI?
Good question, Carmen. So this kind of goes back to the point that I was sharing at the beginning, where we've traditionally really protected our donors and maybe not protected our fundraisers as much. But as we move into a space where we say, how do we protect our fundraisers more? We still do need to hold them accountable to ethical practices and protect our donors as well. One of the things that we're doing right now to try and balance that scale a little bit more to bring frontline fundraisers to a position where they might feel like they are a little bit more protected is that we're convening a task force, very much focused on starting that in the beginning of 2023. It was 2022. I don't know what year it is, 2022. And that is going to be a group of individuals that's going to be across the sector to develop what we're going to be calling a fundraiser's bill of rights. That fundraiser's bill of rights will outline what, as a fundraiser, you can expect and how to be protected. And that will better allow us to, provide guidance to fundraisers specifically. But then as we continue the work that we're doing on our code of ethics with this kind of preamble work and understanding how it's a working code, we can still continue to hold fundraisers accountable for their actions and their practices. And there's a lot of convergence in all of that within, the DEI work that I could go into, but the gist of it is, we've got to find a way to continue to protect that fundraiser and the donor all at the same time.
So when you say protect the fundraiser, you mean no matter who they are, no matter what culture they come from, no matter what, how they identify, you mean protect sort of A to Z. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean it in a way of let's be real. We're sitting here saying we're going to hold our fundraisers accountable if they do something that is not okay to a donor or in a way that they treat a donor, in the way that they collect a donor's information or do something. Our donors should be held to a standard as well. And that if there is someone in a situation with a donor and that donor is treating them in a way that is not acceptable, that we have a way that may not be enforceable, but that we can fall back on to say, no, this person has rights to be able to be treated in a specific way and to have a specific comfort level in their job. And the profession backs that individual up, which makes it that much easier for the organization to be understanding and for the organization to say, let that $500,000 gift go. It's not worth our time. Yes, we need that money, but we can find it in a way that's more ethical to our cause and to what we're trying to achieve for people that are going to treat our fundraisers and our staff in a way that we want them to be treated.
I understand. Thank you for that. How are we doing on time before we continue to go? 3 minutes? Okay. 3 minutes before we go to the breakout? 2 minutes before the breakout? Okay. So you put some pretty large items on the table, and I don't know if we can dig into them in 2 minutes. So let me just think about this. So we've got the fundraiser that is having to both do this balancing act, right? Between not act, but having to balance both their financial, their professional ethics, right? Their personal and personal integrity, along with the professional ethics, and making sure that the two actually don't collide. And so what would you say to the fundraising professional who's, who is nervous about, where are the lines? Where do those conversations take place? Like if a fundraiser finds him or herself in a situation where, you know, a donor of a huge donation is at risk, what's the first thing that they should think about doing? Where's the conversation go?
I think that they need to take a step back and they need to first ask for support from their organization to quickly understand where their organization stands. And then this is also why professional organizations exist. The AFP office is always open for ethical questions for us to be able to provide guidance around if something that's happening is ethical or unethical, and kind of provide guidance on what we would do in that situation. We're not an end all be all by any means, but we're here to help support and provide those answers when possible.
Thank you. And Megan, when there's a suspected data breach or a big question around, you know, does this cross the line? Where do folks go at that point to say, whoa, wait a minute, maybe we should look at that? How does it happen?
It's going to sound very similar to Derek's, taking a step back. And also, I want to stress the preparedness for these situations, right? Having a written out policy for your organization, you know, create it when there's no problems so that when something does happen and everyone's frantic, you have something to fall back on. Mm-hmm. And data breaches, they happen a lot. And so the first thing you want to do is just really, besides talking to your superiors, communicate with your constituents and explain what happened. I mean, there's laws about what you have to disclose and when, depending on what kind of institution you are. Mm-hmm. But making sure that they know that although this happened, they are taking care, that you are taking care of their information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Transparency, disclosure, real important there. All right. Are we ready for breakouts?
Okay. We are ready, and Teresa will help with our breakout session.
Yes. Okay. Here we go.
So go ahead, Teresa.
Oh, yeah. So I'm just going to share that, you know, we're going to have technically 4 different breakout rooms. You'll see on the screen here in the PowerPoint slide, if you just want to stay right here and talk with Frank Choi and I from like the Apra Maryland side about prospect research, development, and analytics in these topics, just stay right here. Otherwise, in a second, you'll get an option to pick either breakout room 1, 2, and 3. You'll see Megan will be in room 1. Derek will be in room 2, and Carmen will be in room 3. So let me open the rooms.
We'll have 10 minutes?
Yes, that is correct. We'll have about 10 minutes. We have a couple of questions to pose to you all, and then we'll come back here for our Q&A.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to give everyone a couple more minutes to hop over if you want to join one of the other breakout rooms just in case. Okay, I guess this is our group. Stop sharing that screen. Welcome everyone. I hope you've all found this as informational as I have so far. As I mentioned earlier, I am Teresa Clark. I am the Vice President of Apra Maryland, and in my daytime job, I am the Associate Director of Donor Data and Analytics at the Foundation Fighting Blindness. I know this is something that we have really been focusing on as, you know, professionals in the industry, as well as at our own particular organizations. Frank, do you want to introduce yourself real quick again for the people that weren't here in the very beginning?
Sure. I'm Frank Choi. I'm also on the Apra Maryland board, and I currently work at Donor Search as a channel sales associate. But prior to this, I have worked actually my entire life in my entire career, sorry, the past 20 years in nonprofits. So working different universities, healthcare systems, and also doing prospect research and prospect management and even database administration. And yeah, like the larger organizations I was at always had a very structured kind of DEI uh, um, policies and procedures that went behind it, but like the smaller organizations really didn't, and I think a lot of that kind of comes from the fact that everybody's trying to just get the work done in those places. So do we have like
We
questions?
do. We do have a couple questions. So we'd love for this to be interactive. So if you guys just want to, if there's something, as I ask the questions, if you guys just want to have come off mute and kind of, first introduce yourself real quick, and then if you have any feedback or anything to say. So our first question is, how do you envision increased awareness of DEI influencing your conversations with colleagues and frontline fundraisers? So I can actually hop in right now. So at the Foundation Fighting Blindness, this is something that we're actively trying to work on. We specifically have a data committee that we're kind of looking at from the data side of things. How are we collecting some of this information? How are we kind of approaching what we're asking our supporters to give us and why are we asking for it? So for instance, our project at the moment is kind of to take stock of how we are collecting and recording and using gender and salutation information. So we went from, whenever you sign up for one of our events, we made gender a required field. So we, kind of looked at the state of things right now and within ourselves kind of said, no, this isn't acceptable. Like if someone doesn't want to identify or if they don't identify as male and female, how are we really collecting that? So we're in the process of changing some of our subscription services, our database, our CRM to kind of be careful around that. So I think this increased awareness of DEI is definitely encouraging some of those conversations at my organization.
Similarly, here at JVC, we changed our salutations to not include any gender. And we actually have it set up now so that the primary donor, if it is not necessarily the head of household. So if it is the wife, her name is first. There was some real, just a blanket taking all Mr. and Mrs. out of the conversation. So it's first name, last name, period. It's a little bit different. It's certainly not a formal environment. And I had a question we use Raiser's Edge. And our executive director said, do we collect any racial, ethnicity, accessibility, any information anywhere? And I said, no, we don't. I mean, we've never seen that as being something that you would collect from a donor perspective. I don't even know where we'd put it. I was looking through the database going, if we were to collect this information for some need, where would we even put it?
You can actually put it in are you using NXT or RE7?
Well, we have RE7, which floats up to NXT. So we have both.
Okay. Yeah, so it's typically on the Bio 1 tab. You can create that field. You can create an ethnicity field, or you can reconstruct a field that you're not using really, and just rename it in the administrative side of things.
Yeah. I mean, I think from my perspective, my question is, do you even need to collect it? Like, what will it be used for? And if you do collect it, who at your organization needs access to that information? Is this just going to be like a benchmarking study? Or is this something that you will actually be using going forward in different roles, and you try to limit that as much as possible, who at your organization has access to that?
Right. We hired a director of DEI, and when we're thinking about our strategic planning, what are our measurements? What do we measure? And how do we determine success and outcomes if we don't collect the data in the first place?
Yeah.
So
I know that. So when I worked at McDaniel, it was the same way. We struck out all of the salutations, and we just made everything first name, last name. We came upon a little bit of backlash only because some of the older generations, the older classes and stuff, were a little bit more traditional. And then you have people who are actually, depending on their careers, are very much into the salutation. Doctors, ex-military, especially if they're higher rankings. So, we had a lot of discussions about that in the administrative or the database administration side. The conclusion we came to was the amount of those people that would speak up and complain about that would be minimal compared to the overall good. So it would be easier for us to just apologize and change their record, and let it happen. And in fact, if anything, it could lead to a better opening for the gift officers to have actually like a really robust discussion, and kind of be, not the most comfortable of talking points, but it is an introduction of sorts. In terms of ethnicity and whatnot, at least on the higher education side, a lot of times, we have those fields because of reporting requirements. So like state and federal, like, governing boards and stuff like that, they want to know what your populations are, in terms of like your alumni base, your current students. So that kind of reporting, because it's not so much reporting for anything insidious or anything kind of like prejudicial, or even like innocently prejudicial through like a donor who wants to say, the one example was, targeting Latino constituents for like a Latina scholarship or something like that. It was more of a reporting perspective of, okay, well, the government wants to know like how much of like certain populations do we have among our constituent base or among our alums and stuff. So, part of that's one of those reasons.
Mm-hmm. So there's a great question from Kimberly in the chat here. She mentions that Salesforce likes to give everybody access to all data points, but how do you determine within your organization who needs access to what? Do you guys have any ideas around that? I'm thinking really it depends upon job roles, and really having a clear understanding across the organization of, to do your job properly, what do you actually need access to? I know from the prospect research side, sometimes we have access to a lot of personal information about donors that we find during our research, and as professionals, sometimes we make the determination of what should and should not even go into the database in the first place. But as opposed to as a frontline fundraiser, I know a lot of frontline fundraisers that say, no, don't give me any information about this donor, because I don't want to go into a new conversation or a new relationship knowing too much. I want to learn it from the donors themselves. So I think from my point of view, it really depends upon role and having frank conversations about, well, you might want this information, but do you really need it to get your job done, and to help your part in the fundraising process?
Thank you for that response, because it's interesting, because we're converting next year, and they just say, we give direct access to everything. And I didn't, we're using Banner, Lucian Banner, and we do restrict certain access. I'm just not comfortable, particularly like with DEI information, who needs to know it, who needs to have access to it, and just to give it to everybody just because it's there doesn't seem responsible, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you can
Thank
do
you.
is what you're currently doing right now in terms of the security roles and those kind of, segments, you could just carry those over because it's not like anybody knows any better, right? Like, the other thing that like what I had done in some of my the other places I've worked is we've posed this to the executive committee and said, hey, look, here's the issue. We need clear definitions for security roles based upon your role here. Now, I have my opinion, my staff have their opinions too, and we were happy to make recommendations, but ultimately that decision and pulling that trigger is above my pay grade. So I need you guys to do this. I can give you my recommendations, you can sign off on it, or you can, edit whatever you need, but we need to have this conversation like now. So, you could always do that. I think when it's collaborative like that also, there's more buy-in,
Could I add something else on that? This is Joanna. Kimberly, I was interested in your struggle, and I think another thing to consider is what data can be maintained. Sometimes if you have so many data points, it's not maintainable, and then you're putting out haphazard data, and it really hurts the integrity of your overall package. And especially when it comes to DEI data, the question, because there's not great collection of it, it always brings to mind what's the default in someone's mind. If it's a blank, what are people thinking? And it kind of creates some interesting questions in my mind ethically on, if it's, do you have enough data to actually present a clear picture, or is it just, lots of holes, and then people are kind of filling in their own mind with that information when it is missing. So anyways, those are just my thoughts. And sorry I jumped in late. I'm traveling and I had lost connection for a bit. So I started out and then lost connection, but I'm back in now.
Anybody else have issues or questions they want to pose to the group? Teresa, do we have any other questions? I think Teresa just went offline for a moment. I apologize, I don't have the questions. It can't be this quiet. Somebody must have a question about ethics and integrity in databases.
Have you guys discussed, and I'm jumping in late, but have you guys discussed like what the drop down selections are? And do you guys personally have issues in that in your database? I'm at Johns Hopkins, and like we're really behind times and we're trying to update it, but like you can't multi-select. Oh, it looks like, is everyone coming back? And I was wondering if anyone else has those type of issues. Looks like Teresa's back as well.
Okay, so we will be starting our question and answer session momentarily.
So if you have questions, now is the time to put them in the chat box.
Well, I think we're all back. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you, Derek, for pinch hitting. So let's hear from, how many breakouts did we end up with? 4?
I think we had 4. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I'll chime in for our group, but before I do that, let's hear from one of the other groups. I had 3, I believe.
I can go, Carmen.
Okay, go ahead, please.
I had frontline fundraisers, and just really, really short. I think the biggest takeaway is that the landscape has changed a lot because of DEI. And the biggest question that we have is, we can do a lot to influence and try and diversify, the fundraising sector and those individuals. But what does that mean for donors? Because that power shift is going to take a lot, and that's a lot out of our hands.
Thank you. Megan, did you have a group?
Yeah, I did. We had a lot of thoughts, not a lot of solutions, but that's always all right. One thing that did come up was, if your leadership is asking you to do something that you find unethical, what do you do, right? But my answer is utilize the resources that, sounds very self-pluggy, but utilize the resources that Apra and AFP and other organizations have, because we've done the work for you. And you can say, here are the reasons why you shouldn't do it, but also present them with solutions. So if someone asks you to, flag everyone who has a Latino Spanish sounding name, flag them as, Latino. No. Let's not do that. Let's take a step back and look at the policies that are already, best practice in the industry.
Thank you. Who had the other breakout?
Teresa and I were in the main room, and we also did talk about like prospect research and analytics. Ours really revolved around, inputting or tracking ethnicity, and also talking about, salutations and whatnot. And, do we, what's best to you just kind of across the board, get rid of salutations and, kind of use more of an informal tone so that you're not really making those assumptions about how people like to be addressed. And also with ethnicity, is it something that really should be tracked? And why are you tracking it? What's really the purpose of that?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was a very good discussion. We kind of, some of us, have worked at organizations where we did do away with salutations altogether. And others, we also talked about like, how do you define security roles for the people in your department to see what sorts of information, and should they be allowed to see all the information? Some people actually willfully do not want to,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you, Frank. We were in the leadership breakout, and just to give a few headlines, there seems to be slow going in terms of moving the needle in or a conversation around DEI, which is very distressing, quite frankly. And leaders are also experiencing that there's in many cases, no formal acknowledgement of the work, and therefore no work is being done, or very little. Or there are people who are who could be leading the work that are not involved in a substantive way in the DEI conversation. And so folks are working very siloed, and there's a lack of readiness just to step into the work and take it head on. And so it leaves folks feeling very demoralized and discouraged, and yet not willing to quit because it's so important. And then finally, some leaders are actually seeing donors and dollars walking out of the door because they're not able to answer the question, what are you doing in the DEI space? What work are you undertaking at your organization? And so funders are not willing to be engaged with organizations who are not serious about doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So those were some of the headlines that came out, and I really appreciate all of you who participated in the breakout rooms. What about questions? Do we have any questions in the chat that we need to maybe pose to our panelists? Teresa?
Yeah, I got disconnected for a minute, so my chat was wiped out. So anyone, if you have questions, drop them right in. And then we'll see.
Okay. So please, if you have any questions. And while folks are giving that some thought, I want to go back to my panelists. Any further thoughts about having participated in the breakouts? Any other takeaways of your own or questions that you might take back to AFP and Apra to further opine on? Derek or Megan? Anything stirring for either one of you?
I'll just say, don't be afraid to ask the hard questions and have the hard conversations. Again, I feel like all that goes without being said, but I don't think we can be reminded of that enough. And really to take that step forward and understanding as a fundraiser how you can influence your entire organization, not just your role and your department, but really work to be able to have that influence. And then lastly, just how can we shift from diversity to inclusion? Because I think that those are the conversations that we need to be having more often.
Thank you, Derek. I don't know if you had.
We do have a question.
Okay.
From Connor. From Connor Wolf, should our donors be representative of the people we serve? If so, how do we do that with the reality of wealth distribution in our nation? I'm going to throw it out to the group and let's see what we can do.
Why don't we take the first part of that? Should our donors be representative of the people we serve?
Take a quick stab at it. I don't have an answer, but I just think that this is an extremely complex question, and I think that that's a question that your organization needs to answer on kind of a case-by-case basis. That being said, it's kind of how you and your organization view fundraising and what the role of fundraising is. You know, AFP really traditionally looks at donor-centric fundraising, where we have organizations like community-centered fundraising that are looking very much more at how are we focusing more on the community and that end result. I think that there's a hybrid approach that allows for some of these things to be, you know, sliced and diced within all of it. But we have to look at viability of the organization, but we also have to stay true to what we believe in. And I think some of those things can be achieved by trying to make them representative of who we serve, and some of them may not be able to be. And I think that is more of a long-term strategy to get there, if that's what you want, than something that you can flip a switch to tomorrow.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you. Other questions?
I actually have a question, just from my personal fundraising life. I know a lot of people that have been asked to be part of DEI conversations and help lead initiatives. And these people are historically part of the minority communities that kind of we want to get this representation from. But I've also heard feedback from these people that, you know, it feels like they're just being asked to do more on top of what they normally do day to day. So how do you really make sure that as part of your DEI efforts, as you're building these policies and procedures and you try to better your organization, that you're not relying too much on those people that are part of these minority groups, that you're trying to have a say, that they don't feel overwhelmed?
it's not unusual to burden the people who carried the burden, right? And so there needs to be some acknowledgement, one, where the burden has historically rested on, and whose responsibility is it to educate individuals, right? Leadership, everybody has to take responsibility for their own education, right? And so involvement and including folks in the work without putting the burden on them to educate you is one thing to think about. I don't know if Megan and Derek have another thought around that.
On a personally, as a white lady, it's, you know, I think we all know that it's all of our responsibility, but it depends on each of us having small conversations with individual people to build that groundswell, right? And as a white lady, making sure that folks of color at our organizations know that they are not alone in this work. And while, you know, I want to be a leader in it, but I also don't want to take anyone's voice. And so kind of being on that fence and making sure that folks know that they are supported, but also that, and that they don't have to do all the work, I think, from my opinion.
Thank you, Megan. You know, this is why leadership is so important to this conversation, because there's risk involved. A lot of times people are concerned about their, you know, holding on to their positions if they raise a question, when really it should not be the case. You know, if it ends in an ism, it causes pain, right? Right. If we don't know anything else about the definition, if it ends in ism, it causes pain and comes with pain. And so leadership has a responsibility to fully embrace it, warts and all, to own, you know, our own stuff as leaders, and free up the staff and everybody else in order to engage, right? Otherwise, that pain just continues. And I see somebody in the chat said it's important to listen more and talk less and compensate accordingly. Yeah. And sometimes, compensating folks for being a part of that, that extra work that it takes to help the organization, you know, stabilize around these things. Let's see, what else? Someone said, one idea that came to mind is for committees, task forces, if you aren't marginalized, but have a heart for it, handle things like that, like meeting coordination and minutes. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of work that if everybody puts their shoulders to the wheel, it can be easier on the organization, but for it to rest on one or two people, or for, you know, people of color, for example, to be the mascot is not okay.
Right. Well, everyone, thank you ever so much for this rich conversation that truly could have continued until 5 o'clock today. But our time is up. So on behalf of the entire planning committee, thank you. I'm Liz Schumann with AFP Maryland, and please join me in offering a round of applause and thanks to our phenomenal team. Our moderator, Carmen Marshall of Maryland Nonprofits, Megan Horton, representing Apra Maryland from UC San Diego, Derek Mulhern from AFP Global. In addition to our speakers and members of the planning committee you heard from today, we'd also like to thank Joanna Schofield, outgoing Apra president. And finally, we'd like to thank you for your insights, your courage, your questions, and your commitment to making our fundraising profession even better. Please stay in touch. Please keep the conversation going and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.